Welcome tonight for this session of our Stephen Crane's Times lecture series. You're here for an interesting lecture, definitely, and something that a lecture that I'm also very much looking forward to. Not only because this is a topic that I'm not really familiar with, and I like to learn new things, even at 62, but also because here's a new colleague that I got to know today, Mary Boyington from the Syracuse University program in Straßburg in France, one of our partner universities. Strasbourg, not Syracuse. But Syracuse, of course, is, that's the stroke of pure genius insofar as this is the university, the one university that Stephen Crane actually attended, if only briefly, and mainly to play baseball. Do you play baseball?
I do not.
You don't know?
No.
Softball?
No.
I'm
either.
I'm teaching a class on sports at the moment. She teaches in this program advanced French, both the language and society and culture, but also American expat literature, which is what also informs the lecture today. Mary Boyington originally hails from New Orleans, and of course, if you're from there, there's a bigger chance that you turn into something interested in French as literature, culture, and so on, rather than anywhere else in the United States. So she studied French literature in the US and American literature in France. That makes a lot of sense if you think of it. And her doctoral dissertation at the University of Marseille was on Esprit de Maupassant, Henry James and the French Realist movement, a re-evaluation, under the direction of Professor Annick Duperret and also Philip Hone. Both of them are very well known in the field. And I'll leave that here with you because you apparently need it.
I need it, yes.
You need it for something, and I'll withdraw and leave the field to Mary Boyington.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today and inviting me to give this lecture. Syracuse University has a partnership agreement with the Université de Strasbourg, and I'm very happy to represent them here today and to speak to you about Henry James. On discovering the theme of this lecture series and Stephen Crane, I was very much drawn to this subject because, as most people in the United States, we study Stephen Crane in high school. I had not continued my studies of his work beyond my initial American literature classes, probably at the age of 16. And in preparing today's lecture to talk to you about Henry James, I thought, what is the connection with Stephen Crane and Henry James other than their 1900 association in London, outside of London in Surrey? And I felt that I discovered what I considered to be a blind spot in James' studies, in that clearly they knew each other, but the scholarship on the subject is not very detailed or readily available. And so I think that is something for us to explore, and I want to talk about Henry James and the French realist writers today. So I put realists in quotes, as you'll see, Henry James and the French realist, because not all of them were realists, some were naturalists. And when we talk about literary movements, it's quite a complex discussion. So I think no one person ever belongs to one literary movement. And in talking about Henry James, with an American author with such a long literary career, we can really analyze that he belonged to probably 4 literary movements. James began his literary career with the publication in 1864 of a short story, Tragedy of Error. And does anyone know, 1867. Does anybody know what the 4 literary movements are that we can say that James probably belonged to admired. So in the 1860s, his literary models are, of course, Hawthorne. At the beginning of his career, he writes short stories that he calls romance. And then, not only is he a writer in the 1860s, but he begins to start his criticism of literature. And so James, when we look at his literary career, he is equally important as literary critic, published many essays in literary magazines that we've already talked about in this lecture series in the introduction, and really is setting a tone for the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century of what is literary criticism and what is the role of the critic of literature, works of literature, and also bodies of work by different authors. At this time, James is very critical of what he perceives as realism. And I wanted to share with you, so here we have the essays on French writers. I want to share with you just some quotes by James. In my studies of James and going to international meetings and reading his work, I didn't know that he was so funny. And I think that's something that we miss in our studies of Henry James, is the real humor behind it. Sometimes we can find that in the portrayal, mainly the reader who's reading this can read it very seriously, very dry, or we can find the real humor in it. So one of the important topics that we'll be talking about today throughout the career is that he wrote more than 100 essays on French authors. He is probably the most significant contributor to the canon of French literature that we know as Americans or English speakers. He wrote on contemporary novelists, poets, playwrights. He wrote about things that were readily available for publishing, but also works of literature that he admired, and then works of literature that he despised. And I think that is what we're going to discover today, that this is not just Henry James in admiration of French literature in the late 18th century and into parts of the early 19th century and into parts of the early 20th century, but he is someone that's very opinionated and often changes his mind. So what he said on one first occasion is not necessarily the last word on anything, except for one person, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But I wanted to start with one of the early critical essays on French realist writers by Alexandre Dumas fils. So I guess fils is kind of like the junior, right? The son of Alexandre Dumas. He wrote this essay on the Affaire Clemenceau, where he talks about this realism in French literature at the time. And things that he says, to be completely great, a work of art must lift up the reader's heart. It is the artist's secret to reconcile this condition with the image of the barest and sternest reality. So whereas we may consider Henry James to be a realist, sometimes a naturalist, very rarely, but still possible, and a modernist writer, when we look at him as a young man, his comments here are quite harsh and very different from the things that we associate him with later in his literary career. And as we've already mentioned, what is realism? These comments here in this essay are in some ways contradictory to what we know as the benefits of Henry James to the literary movement of realism. So life is dispiriting, art is inspiring, and a storyteller who aims at anything more than a fleeting success has no right to tell an ugly story unless he knows its beautiful counterpart. So these are very strong words. And the last part, these are all from the same essay on the Affaire Clemenceau, is, since the taste of the age is for realism, all thanks to such realism as this. It fortifies and enlarges the mind. It disciplines the fancy. So we're not completely in total agreement for this literary movement that's particularly emerging in France. These are some of the Second Empire or Napoleon III writers that have bridged the gap between what we know as Romanticism and the new guard who's coming in the 1870s of writers like Flaubert, so who wrote Madame Bovary. Okay? Early James feels the need to create a literary community. And to his friend, Thomas Sargent Perry, while he is a student studying, he did 1 year of Harvard Law School. He writes to his friend in 1867, and he says, "But men don't accomplish valuable results alone, dear Sarge. And there will be nothing so useful to me as the thought of having companions and a laborer with whom I may exchange feelings and ideas. It is by this constant exchange and comparison, by the wear and tear of living and talking and observing, that works of art shape themselves into completeness. And as artists and workers, we owe most to those who bring us most human life." So I think what's really important is to set the stage here for what is coming later. Right? This is why I'm giving you this brief introduction, I admit, to Henry James in the 1860s, to get to where we're going in the 1870s and then later in the 1890s. And we'll kind of finish up our discussion today with 1900, and I'll just give you a little bit of a look forward to, in case you ever have the chance, and I hope you do, the opportunity to really explore Henry James's work and James studies to what comes next. And I know that the students at the Université de Strasbourg, those who studied for the teacher exam, they had the pleasure of getting to study one of James's greatest novels, The Wings of the Dove, and that's something published after 1900. But that's to give you a chronological situation of where our talk today is going to go. So, 1867, James is a budding writer. He's starting to write these essays, getting things published regularly, becoming someone who is setting the tone for what is literary criticism, what is the role of the critic, what is the role of these emerging literary magazines, and how they contribute to the society of letters in the United States. When, in 1875, Henry James gets a job with the New York Tribune as a writer to become a journalist reporting life from Paris, packs his bags, and decides to leave America to go and live, settle there, and work as a full-time writer, to make his career as an author. Why is this significant? It's a conscious decision to leave the United States. One of James's major themes throughout his work is the international novel, the transnational, transatlantic theme. He grew up in the different parts of Europe. He grew up in France. In his autobiography, he states some of his earliest memories were in Paris. He had schooling in Switzerland. His family traveled and was quite worldly. And so therefore, he wants to return to this European sensibility. In some ways, it's his first distance with American letters, with saying that the literary community that there is in France at the moment attracts him more than, while he's looking for this camaraderie, he's not finding it in the US. And he thinks as he arrives in Paris, this will be the case. Before James leaves, he does set out in 1875 the framework of admiration of Honoré de Balzac. So has anyone here studied French literature at all? Does anyone have any ideas? A little bit? Balzac, James determines that he is the father of us all. His Comédie Humaine, which is a great work of all of Balzac's novels and short stories published together in a 23-volume set, is the end model of where James is going to go later in his career. And in 1875, before leaving, he publishes one of 3 major essays on the author. Why is Balzac's work so important to James? Balzac, of course, predates the realist writers that James is going to meet. Balzac is really this bridge between Romanticism and realism as we know it in the 1870s. He is a master at portraying things. His attention to detail is unprecedented, and he is really able to paint the picture or the portrait to allow his reader to enter into his universe that he creates. Henry James sees him as his main literary model, and I think that by establishing Balzac as he calls him, the father of us all, and the main literary model, it makes sense that when he arrived in Paris in 1875, that he is confronted with the reality of French society, the changes that have occurred, right? The Second Republic leads to the Second Empire. Those things are over, and now we're in the Third Republic. France has seen war, the Commune, and now the rise of industrialization, and society has radically changed since James the child has been there. And as a 3-year-old small child or a young boy taking classes with a governess, he's confronted with this new, different, and moving towards a modern society. So in 1875, he arrives. Luckily, he is accompanied by a letter of introduction that gets him to meet Gustave Flaubert. So James leaves the U.S. to settle permanently. Of course, this is in quotations. Many things that I say about Henry James will be in quotations in Paris. And here he meets who is at the time the elite of French literary society. But James knows little of them. He's read their works. He's read Madame Bovary. He's read Flaubert. But at the time, he still has a connection to the earlier works that predate 1870, that predate the Franco-Prussian War, the Second Empire novelists. He thinks that the French literature that he is confronted with when he arrives is maybe too real. And he's very concerned, mostly in his early career, less so in his later career, with questions of morality. And that's not so much the concern of the French writers that he meets at the time. So Flaubert has an apartment, and on Sundays, people come for a type of literary salon. We call it the Cénacle, and there he is introduced to many other members of literary society. I've included here photos of Zola, who's very important. We'll get to talk about him in a moment, and Guy de Maupassant. These are two that I've included their photos here for you to see. There were, of course, many others, as this was the gathering every week. People would come and go. It was very animated. Other writers like les Frères Goncourt, Daudet, would come and participate. And it was this habit that they would come, and just like James described to his friend Thomas in his earlier letter, here he finally finds this community of writers where they come together and their main purpose is to talk about what they are doing, to discuss their subject matter, to read each other's works and really support each other. And I think that's probably what impressed James the most. And one of his first impressions that he writes to his same friend, Thomas Sargent Perry, is that je suis dans les conseils des dieux que je suis lancé en plein Olympe. And he says, I am in the council of the gods. I am at Mount Olympus, right? And if we know anything about Greek mythology, we know that mere mortals like ourselves never dared to approach the mountain where Zeus and his cohort of gods lived and ruled society. And as I mentioned earlier, we can never take Henry James at his word because it will change later. So what does this mean, this idea of discussing literature, and how did Henry James receive this information? So I have this letter up here from 1876, February the 3rd, and we'll look at this and then we'll take a chance to go through. He, Turgenev, so we'll talk about him in a moment, has made me acquainted with G. Flaubert, to whom I have likewise taken a great fancy, at whose house I have seen the little coterie of young realists in fiction. They are all charming talkers, though as editor of the austere Atlantic, it would startle you to hear some of the projected subjects, okay? And I think you've also mentioned William Dean Howells as a very much realist writer in the United States, and more important than his own fiction contributions was his role as editor of literary magazines. The other day, Edmond de Goncourt, the best of them, I think that might be ironic, said he had been lately working on very well on his novel, and he had gotten upon an episode that greatly interested him, into which he was going very far. Flaubert, what is it? Edmond de Goncourt, a whorehouse de Provence. So, what we know of Henry James, young, innocent man, very much with a strong moral compass, is shocked and mortified by these discussions. If we go back and think about what he said already about Alexandre Dumas, so if we dial back a few years, that was too grimy of a realism, and now we've just taken things up a few notches, and the subject matter is not only immoral, it's something that is very much easily rejected by the young James. So I want to take a few minutes and talk about Zola, Flaubert, and Maupassant, the other artists who were present at the Cénacle, and why these artists had such a strong impact on Henry James, to the point that at the end of 1876, he rejects them. He's gone through some kind of roller coaster of emotions, and he says, I've had it with them. I can't live here. I can't stay in Paris, and I have to leave. One of the things that's very important to note is that he considered Zola and his naturalism to be even more pushed to the limits of what was acceptable in society. So, subject matter mattered, as did treatment of the subject. So, when we talk about Zola, we have to look at his collection of work where he is looking at workers, prostitutes, people who are at the lowest of society, compared to Henry James's fiction, which are based on maybe not aristocrats, but middle class, and their interactions with the levels of aristocratic society. And these things were shocking to him. I think he was unable to process them at the time, and the proof is that he comes back to them later. I wanted to read to you a little bit about the people who would come. So he wrote to Howells again, and that he had struck roots in the Parisian soil, that he was able to grow there. And what's very interesting is that those roots will go very deep. They will stay for the rest of James's career. And those roots in the Parisian soil, even though he moves on, remain in that same place and with these writers who had the greatest influence on his overall work. Basically, Maupassant, who I guess I could go back to the photos here. Zola is a published author. Flaubert is a published author. The Goncourt are publishing. But Maupassant is under the apprenticeship of Flaubert. He is going to publish and become an important figure in French literature later. And I think Henry James identified greatly with him. We have to make inferences as to their interactions, and we don't know the exact details because we can only imagine, as the two younger people in this very animated literary salon, they were not at the center stage. They were not at the forefront. And maybe that is how the connections between the two grew significantly. So, any questions so far? Pretty clear, okay. Great. So I wanted to talk about how James met Maupassant. It was not only an afternoon at Flaubert, but they talked about the poet Swinburne. And there was a raucous story that involved a monkey and all of the things around this. So basically it was a story about two Englishmen. There was implicit homosexuality, and then, of course, the monkey. I think it was too much for young Henry James. And we get many of this information much later that comes back to us from 1912, when James is recalling the memory at Flaubert's. And I wanted to read this. So he says, "I pull myself together and I invoke a fond memory as you urge upon me, and I feel that I must remind you of a certain inevitable weakness," meaning the fact that the precious fact Maupassant having in the night of time and the general failure of inspiring prescience so remarkably regaled me. Guy's story, as he was known only as Guy then, here they are at it. I remember that as my main inward comment on Maupassant's vivid little history, which was thus thereby somehow more vivid to me about him than either our friends or the monkey, as to whom, as I say, it didn't in the least foresee this present hour of arrangement. So he's writing this on to his friend Edmund Gosse, who is an important literary figure in the early 20th century in 1912, and is talking about this salacious story and remembers his friend very fondly. Now, Maupassant figures little in this group, but has, I believe, to have the greatest impact on Henry James's works of fiction in the 1890s. When studying the French realist writers, you also do a lot of research about what critics of French literature and of American literature say. And people are very much divided. When I came up with my research project to work on Maupassant, people said, but wait, Henry James and Flaubert are much stronger connections. Or what about Zola, his rejection of Zola's naturalism, but then he incorporates it into his own works later in the 1880s. And they said, but the natural connection is, of course, Balzac. But Maupassant, just like I feel Stephen Crane here, has some kind of blind spot in the academic research with Henry James and isn't given the full connection and consideration that he deserves. Maupassant is definitely a realist writer, has an exceptional power of observation, is able to relate to readers in precise detail exactly what's happening in a situation, in a relationship, in a place, but with less words. And Balzac is someone who fills the space with many words, lots of things. And the two are basically antithesis of each other. I think Henry James's own struggle in his writing is to reconcile his admiration of these two writers. Somehow, Flaubert moves on as an important character who organized these meetings of the French realists. One of his earlier introductions to new realism in France, and I say the new realism being different than what he was already used to, of having Henry James question what is morality, what is the role of morality. If you haven't read Madame Bovary, it's a story of a young woman who lives inside of her imaginary world where she reads excessively. She reads romances, and her poor, ordinary husband is not interesting to her, and therefore she takes on several lovers. The subject of adultery was probably too much for Henry James at the time. And then we just kind of, dial it up bit by bit until we get to novels about whorehouses and other unclean subjects. So I want to talk a little bit more about unclean things. This novel that Goncourt wrote, La Fille Elisa, is, in James's consideration, perhaps even superior to the audacity that we find in Émile Zola's L'Assommoir. So L'Assommoir is also a novel that James feels didn't have a noble subject matter. It's about a washerwoman and talks about the really grimy, non-polished, deep, real aspects of society. You may be more familiar with Zola's work Germinal that talks about the mines in northern France where people worked and the mistreatment of workers. And again, this is so far removed from James's own work where the American, for example, a young person comes and is involved with an aristocratic family, lives in Paris, searching for a suitable marriage partner. And we have somewhat of a carryover of early 19th century themes, the marriage plot, class society, and how does one find one's place in that area. So he really gets stuck on these notions of unpleasant concerns, this lack of the picturesque, but what we find is a real portrait of what is happening at the time. And I have a quote for us here. So in the 1876 letter to the New York Tribune, if you remember that James is working for the Tribune and is sending articles back to be published. This is how he's making a living in France at the time. Émile Zola, a pupil of Gustave Flaubert, is, as a novelist, the most thoroughgoing of the little band of the out-and-out realists. Unfortunately, the real, for him, means exclusively the unclean, and he utters his crudities with an air of bravado which makes them doubly intolerable. Okay? If James was anything, he wasn't shy about expressing his opinions on things. So, as I mentioned, James rejects all of this, says, why can't we go back in time to these basically unknown writers that we know little of, today, from the Second Empire, before society changed, and they're nice little stories all wrapped up in a package, and he basically was reading these in the journal La Revue des Deux Mondes, which also had an editorial stance in rejection of realism and naturalism. And so really this year that James spent in Paris was quite difficult. There was a lot of intellectual confrontation. And I see now that we all have that. And you may be having that. You may be experiencing, wait a minute, the things I thought I knew and I thought were right and good, and of course the question of morality and suitability and what is for the progression of literary society. I reject these things, but then he's not going to forget about them. And I think that's the most important thing we need to realize. And since, after all, this is a class on Stephen Crane, and we're talking about Henry James because he is such an important literary figure, he eventually comes around. And these roots in the Parisian soil that I mentioned, they're going to be nourished, and he's going to continue reading French literature. So what's interesting is this rejection is really just kind of putting it to the back of his mind. And an important critic of Henry James and of this is Peter Brooks, and he's written several books about this, and one of his more recent works is Henry James Goes to Paris, and he says that his main thesis on the topic is that James is going to come back to this later in life. And he says he comes back to it in the 1890s, and I think James is really coming back to it in the 1880s. And he is moving beyond his great success of Portrait of a Lady to kind of start this experiment in literature writing. And he's starting with what is really going on in society. Can I look at things differently? And in the novel The Princess Casamassima, he's really looking at characters who are different, both physically and morally, and character development different, and then the setting is different. We've moved from the nice squares in London or the boulevards in Paris to scenes where we enter into the prison and we see different levels of society. Unfortunately for James, this was not a commercial success. And the publishing world being what it was, the public, magazine editors, and novel sales dictated very much of what authors were able to do. It's very different than today, and not only are we talking about monetary value and being paid for your works, but also being accepted into publication, public perception, reputation, and James's own value of his self-worth as an author. He suffered from depression at times, often linked to any kind of setback in his publishing or other writing career. So now I want to talk about this return to the 1990s and how the French realists come back. And I want to talk about a little bit about Maupassant, and then kind of try to bring all these things together in the next little bit. So I think something that's interesting for us to note, as I've tried to break up a very long literary career that starts in the 1870s and ends at James's death right during World War I, is there are scholars who divide it into 3 sections. Maybe we can divide it into 4. And I think I've mentioned this for you today. So what we have is the early entrance into his career. Then if we want to call a subside of the 1880s, his naturalist experiment. Then moving into the 1890s, we call this his experimental phase. And then in the 1900s, at the turn of the century, we move on to James's major phase. In the 1890s, James has now read everything published by all of the authors he met at Flaubert's in 1875. He packed up in 1876, moved away, but he only moved to London, and he came back as frequently and as regularly to Paris for short trips. He continued to write essays, published collections of essays on French writers, and remember I said that at the end of his career, he's published over 100 essays on French writers and works of literature. In the 1890s, Henry James decides, my future is the London stage. Well, that didn't happen. We don't know Henry James as a famous playwright. People at the same time, like Henrik Ibsen, were making great plays, reputation, literature, but that didn't happen for Henry James. And this was a huge blow to him. So at this time, he is going to re-examine what is happening in letters in the Anglophone world. So both American literature and English literature. We'll talk about this question of where does Henry James belong? Is he an American writer living in London? Do people claim him as an English writer? Which one is it? So he decides to reject the novel. That didn't work for him very well. He kind of tried this naturalist experiment and to make forays into short fiction. I think we've seen a little bit here some of the letters, but one thing we won't go in depth in today, but I suggest to you that any study of Henry James must look at the 4 areas of him as a writer. And the 4 areas that are 2 are his public writings, so that would be his writings, his works of fiction, and his essays that are published in the literary magazines or collected that he did for publishing them in book form, and then the private writings. And I think it's in the private writings where we get the most insight about him and what is literary production and what he was thinking and doing at the time. And we get those from 2 sources. One from his letters. He was a prolific letter writer. I don't know how all the people he wrote letters to saved all his letters, but they did. And then we have the letters he wrote, and then some of the letters that he received. And then we have his, what we call the notebooks, were little books that he kept, and just like I call them writer's journals, where he talked about his inspiration, his thinking, things that he saw, and then would turn them into a work of fiction after, ideas that he had, and he would write them down. And we are very lucky today that he was unable to destroy all of the things that he had hoped to destroy. At his house, he built a giant bonfire and burned quite a lot of things. The James family, after his death, also had great control and tried to remove a lot of information from both the letters and the notebooks. And I want to commend the editors of the complete letters of Henry James, as they have done an excellent job of going through archives, private collections, auctions to get these letters back. And that's how we get a significant amount of information about what James was thinking. So in the 1890s, he's thinking really to look at what we can now consider probably his closest attempt at realism. But it's not just the depiction of an event, of a place. We're now starting to include the notion of human consciousness. And that's where it becomes very important and very interesting. His brother was a famous psychologist, William James. You can imagine that the writings of Sigmund Freud are starting to appear at this time. Changes are happening, and James is incorporating that into his writing. He's rejected the form of the big novel. That doesn't mean he's rejected it forever, because we know, come back to it later. And he's taken on the notion of writing very short things. Are they short? No. They're long, short things. And I say you have to find the humor in it. And one of the things I suggested that you could read in preparation for today's lecture, but I won't talk about the text, but I think it's something that gives us a very good idea of where we are situating things in the 19th century, is the turn of the screw. I think today we would not call it a short story because it doesn't fit the categories established by the short story. We would call it more of a novella. And James himself was focused on writing things that he called short things because he couldn't necessarily assign a genre to them. So we're questioning genre and moving towards a different level of human consciousness. And that's probably the most important thing that is happening in the work of Henry James when he meets Stephen Crane at the end of the 1890s. We can be mostly assured that Crane read James, of course, because everyone read James. James is the most important writer in English letters. And when I say English letters, I mean in both the US and in England and the other English-speaking countries of the United Kingdom. These questions of how to portray consciousness influence coming back of the French realists and changing perspective, changing what is a suitable subject, what is morality, who are my characters, what is going on, the increased use of ambiguity. So we've moved from novels where everything is easily laid out for us and we have all the answers, to things where we don't know what the ending is. We don't know what was in the secret letter. We don't know what was said in a conversation. And we don't know if there really are ghosts or not. And I think the biggest contribution of James's body of fiction writing in the 1890s are also his ghost tales and his investigation into what is happening in the mind and in human consciousness through the use of the supernatural. And when I say ghost tales, I don't mean what he called pot boilers, like Charles Dickens' ghost. You know, it's not the Christmas Carol, or it's not a ghost we can readily see. It's a ghost that exists, and we have to work on who is that ghost, why are they here, and what is their role in the text and in the story in general. I've thought about a lot of things in studying Henry James and why students and I think scholars still enjoy working on him, and why there's a wealth of academic scholarship, but a waning public interest in Henry James. And I think it's the high level of ambiguity in the text. I think, we hear things like, oh, he's hard to read. And I think it's hard because it requires us to think and fill in so many missing gaps. And all of us could read something and come to our own conclusions, and they could all be different. And I think that's not what's hard, but that is what brings the richness. And I think when today other writers often cite Henry James as an important influence or literary figure, because this notion of influence, it can't just be a 1 + 1 is 2 easy equation. I think it's because of the way that he was able to portray these questions and make people think in such a way. And I just want to come back to this notion of a group of writers who can come together and share ideas and work together. And that is when in 1900 we see these 4 writers. So of course Henry James, who's much older at the time now, we often refer to him as the master. He's had huge success, disappointing failure, questioned genre, had difficulties in the publishing worlds, and kind of gone through this whole roller coaster of what it means to be a writer. some people who we know read him, wrote about him, and used a lot of his ideas. There's Joseph Conrad is here, The Heart of Darkness. Have you all read that? H.G. Wells and Ford Madox Ford all had a little literary group together in southern England. James lived in London for a long time. There was this culture of clubs. When I say that, it's not nightclubs, but literary clubs like the Reformer Club, where people would go and discuss things. And now James has decided to move out of the city into the country, and that's where he meets Stephen Crane, who is also there. We know he's already ill and already taken with tuberculosis, and all of this, of course, was in the introduction to the course, so I'm just repeating what you already know. But one thing that I found that was interesting in doing my research about the two, and I knew they met each other, and thanks to our presentation the other day, we even saw Henry James eating donuts at the party at Stephen Crane's house. We know that they went to Lamb House, Henry James's own house. And I found this New York Times article about a 1982 novel called Group Portrait, written about the five of them together. And I thought, wow, this predates, because it's actually it was quite popular at the time to work on these types of novels about historical writers and put together historical fiction. And of course, Henry James is no stranger to these types of novels. We, of course, have Author, and The Master, about the life and the writing of Henry James, and so I thought it was really interesting. I, of course, didn't have time to order a copy and read the novel, but it's now on my list of things to do. And this is the 1982 article in the New York Times, and I thought it was great that this is the picture they included. And then I realized, gosh, we too are going through something in society, right? How long has it been since you've seen this kind of engraving in a newspaper? And then I took the chance to flip through the newspaper and look at what reproduced photos were like. And it was completely different than anything that we have today. And I thought even our depiction and the importance of media, which we talk about frequently when we talk about the publishing world and the 19th century, I was having a similar response today in 2021 while going through and looking at these articles in the newspaper, and that in just, I guess it is 40 years ago, have changed radically, and how we receive information and what the internet has done for us. So I wanted to kind of just wrap up with this idea and tell you that clearly Crane is reading James, and I believe strongly also looking at French literature, and most probably Émile Zola, to be able to get to where he is in this progression of American letters at the end of the 19th century. And I mentioned earlier this blind spot that James Studies has for Maupassant. I also think that this connection between James and Crane could be explored further. So I think if you are looking for areas of research to do and analysis, that would be something that would be an excellent area to look into. We tend to, as scholars of literature, sometimes overlook these texts that we deem introductory. In French, I would call them scolaires. things that we read as young people, we must come back to again and again. And even though maybe it was just 4 or 5 years ago and now you can come to them again, I think by re-examining authors like Stephen Crane and Maupassant, we can find their connections to other great writers such as Henry James. And it's really unfortunate that James has fallen out of favor in contemporary circles in terms of reading his novels. I think the most important thing is the influence and the progression that he's had all the way up until today into the 21st century. So I just want to end with, I did find one letter, and it's Henry James's letter to Cora Crane. And James was plagued, of course, with a lot of death in and around him throughout his whole life. His cousin, his friends, his brother, his sister. He was very much touched by Maupassant's death. And here we see that he was really unconsolable also, and very much touched by Stephen Crane's death. Now, this is just before, and he wrote this letter, and it's written to Cora Crane, which we know was his common law wife, and but he uses Crane's name here. And he says, "It's a shock to me that Crane is less well. I was full of hope and had been in the hope, assuming that a good effect had come from him to his move. Cheerful theories, much disconcerted. I think of them with no more sympathy and sorrow than I can say. I wish I could express this to him more closely and personally." And then I'm taking excerpts here. "I bicycled over to Breda with a couple of friends a day or two after you had gone to show them the face of the old house, but the melancholy of it was quite heartbreaking. So will it, I fear, always be to me. I won't pretend to utter hopes about Crane, which may be in vain, or seem to you now, and thereby only irritating or at least distressing. But I constantly think of him, as it were, pray for him. I needn't tell you how glad I shall be of any news that you are able to send me. I wish you all the courage, as much hope as possible, and I am yours and his in deep participation." So interestingly enough, James enclosed a 50-pound check in this letter, and hoped that she could find a bank here in Baden-Württemberg to cash the check to help defray any costs. And I think this letter shows us that Henry James did not reject Stephen Crane, had a great affection for him as a person, had a great admiration for his writing, did not judge him harshly as young James did to other naturalist writers. I believe he had an admiration for him as a soldier, that James, he himself, could not participate in the war. He had what we called the obscure hurt. Something happened to him as a young person which plagued him the rest of his life. And if you're looking for a question to an answer, I think the biggest ambiguity in Henry James's life is, what was the obscure hurt? No one knows. It's just like the letters thrown onto the fire, or the conversation that we don't hear. It goes into the same level of ambiguity. And he had a deep connection to people. He believed strongly in young writers, just like he believed in Maupassant. He supported Crane. And I think it's unfortunate they weren't able to develop their relationship further beyond their literary circle, and the importance that James placed on this exchange between writers and helping to elevate text and further literature. So thank you very much for your attention today, and see if anybody has any questions.
I'm still trying to get accustomed to the idea of Henry James on a bicycle, but
did. I think he did ride. He lived out at Lamb House, and I think he did ride his bicycle quite a bit. Yes?
How did you react to Henry James's writing when you first read it?
Oh, how did I react to Henry James's writing when I first read it? So I tried to think of the first thing I read, and I think the first thing that I remember reading, I think maybe I read Daisy Miller, which is a novella, 1870s. As a graduate student, starting my Ph.D., but for the first time, not the third time, I read The Turn of the Screw in a course that actually greatly influenced all of my future academic endeavors on the fantastic in American literature. So we read writers like Ambrose Bierce, we read Mark Twain, Henry James. I think we read Moby Dick. So it was a while ago. Not this time. And I was terrified by the story because it's something that really gets to you and really speaks to you as what is happening here. And I saw the opera, The Turn of the Screw, a few years ago, and I was disappointed at the production because they showed too much and they gave everything away. And this is really when I came to this idea that today we want everything in a nice little package. And I think The Turn of the Screw, it was a page turner. I couldn't stop. Now, since then, did the third PhD attempt, I got that one. I read quite a lot more James. And it's not always easy. Sometimes you read it and you have to go back to it, but I really think that when you complement it with the letters and the notebooks, you have a deep affection for this writer. And I think whenever working with, then I became part of this international network of Henry James scholars, and then you really get to know, it's like a real person and not just a novel. And then the novel speaks to you so much more and you understand more. And when you have the bibliographical, it's kind of like a snowball, but in a good way. So my biggest advice is stick with it. It's tough. Sometimes it makes you a little sleepy. And I think it makes you sleepy because your brain is working so hard. And you just kind of have to hang on and get through it. And then you realize, how fascinating it really is. Any other questions? Have you all read Henry James? What have you read? The Turn of the Screw is great.
And I found it really hard, even though I think the story is really interesting. I just felt really sleepy, but I might give it another chance.
Give it another chance.
That he's actually such an interesting person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for your attention today. I hope you've enjoyed this talk and this introduction to such an important figure in 19th and 20th century literature. I, of course, didn't have nearly enough time to talk about what happens after 1900 and the three major novels that James writes and publishes at that time, and then his involvement in World War I. I'll give you just a teaser so that maybe you yourself will go and investigate these things. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mary Boyington. I just picked up something I remembered from my old friend Tom Whalen, who was a Henry James fan, probably still is for all I can tell. And he quoted something that I found here again in heaven there's no algebra, no learning dates or names, but only playing golden harps and reading Henry James. So that, at least for a while, was the reputation that Henry James had, and if he's fallen a bit from grace since then, it's probably undeserved. And thank you very much. I learned a lot today. I freely admit that. I had no idea. Well, what you learn sort of when you've been around for 62 years and a professor for 20, about the French realists and so on. But for instance, the hilarious story about Swinburne and the monkey and so on, I'll ask you about the details later. So again, thank you all for coming, and I hope I'll see you all again next week.